airport because that was a large lake at the end of the Ice Age. Around your area, it would be the Mississippi River area, the large creeks, or the large streams, the large springs that are there, like Babbler Spring, would have attracted these Pleistocene animals. And where there's animals, there's people wanting to hunt them. And the earliest points, spear points that they use, people are kind of amazed by, but those are the most delicate and the most carefully crafted of the points. It's because a lot of their efforts went into killing. Animals were the main source of food at the time, being the Ice Age, so there wasn't a lot of plants. So you see a lot of their artistic skills went into the projectile points. Now, this shows up at every museum where they're driving the big mastodons into the river, into the muddy water, and supposed to be, people used to think that that would mire the animal down. Problem is, it mires the people down too if they're in there. So I wouldn't want to be in the muddy water with a wounded mastodon thrashing about. It's probably like that guy that you see at the upper right. He'd probably end up dead like him. Instead, what people did, they knew where the watering holes were and other places where these animals would congregate, and they would wait for them to show up. They would have two people watching the hunting, the trail that they would walk on, and while the other people would camp nearby. And once the animals showed up, then they would come out and hunt them. About 10,000 years ago, the environment changed and it became warmer, more like we know of it today. That lake dried up and you get the oak hickory forest here instead of the spruce cedar forest. And all the large animals died off, probably because of climate change, but also due to overhunting by the people. Because the horses and camels actually evolved here in the United States earlier than at first, and they actually traveled across the land bridge over into the old world where they survived until later times. After this time period, we get a time period that's called Archaic Period, and it used to be they thought that people struggled and it was really rough to live at that time. It was probably more our archaic views of these people than what life was really like. They did hunt deer and other animals using a spear thrower or an atlatl. And that's what you see the guy holding in his hand there. And that allows you to throw a spear further and with more power than if you do with your hand. Now, the problem is this picture shows them carrying like 3 or 4 or 5 spears. You wouldn't want to carry those long spears through the woods in this area. You'd be all tangled up. So instead, they only had one long spear, and then they had a bunch of smaller spear points that they had on a foreshaft, and that would stick into the longer spear. When it hits the animal, that pops off, the spear would actually pop off and fall on the ground, and they could run up and reload it again, sort of a prehistoric machine gun. And you shoot as many times as you want that way. These things that people are called arrowheads, are really spear points. They're not arrowheads. And they were used with that spear thrower. The real tiny little points that people call bird points are actually arrowheads. I wouldn't want to throw them. I wouldn't shoot one of those big spear tips out of a small arrow. It wouldn't go very far. The first people in this area used, after the end of the Ice Age, used what we call a seasonal round, where they moved from one area in their territory to the next. Based on the season and where the most resources were at that time. And then they would start that round again and start all over again. Because of that, they had houses. People always think they lived in caves and rock shelters. They did not live in caves and rock shelters. They lived in houses. Now, these early homes were fairly small and difficult for us to find, but we can find the other pits and things that they dug. For instance, the fireplaces that they dig. Anytime a person digs a hole on the ground, you change the color and the feel of that dirt, so we're able to see it. And this is an example of a fire hearth. If you had a campfire and you build it today, it would look like this right when it's done. And what it does is the campfire scorches the ground red, and so you know that somebody had built a campfire there. You can take the charcoal that the wood turns into after it's been burned, and can date that and tell what type of tree they were using, or whether they were taking rotten wood off the ground, or whether they were cutting trees down to burn in their fires. Quite a bit you can tell by looking at these little fireplaces. Since they're using a seasonal round, if you're at a nut processing place, or nut place where you're gathering nuts, you don't want to carry your nut processing tools with you to a winter camp or a summer camp. You want to leave them there. And so what they would do, they would dig pits in the ground and cover them over, and that's where they would get their stuff when they need it when they returned. Sometimes they would use rock shelters and caves as a place to store these goods for the next season. This is an example of actually a site not very far from you all that was a storage pit, and it's got all the things you need to make a stone tool out of that. Sometimes you can find the food itself, the bones. This is 3,000 snails. They were about 2 inches in diameter. This is Escargo day at this site. About 6,000 BC, they changed. It was the height of the hypsothermal period. It was a warmer time. And so the prairies expanded, the rivers dropped, and made mussels more available and fish more available. So you do see fish and mussels becoming more predominant. They also seem to so instead of deer, you start to see actually more fish in their diet. At this time too, they developed tools to process foods, their preferred foods. One of the preferred foods was nuts. They weren't agriculturalists yet, so nuts was used for all the things you used for grains for making bread, for making foods, all that kind of thing. And so but instead of cracking a nut with a nut cracker, what they did was get these pits, fill them with water, drop in a hot rock to get it boiling. Then they would sit on the side on another stone. They would put about 5 or 6 or 7 nuts, take another stone and crush them up and throw the shells and the nut meat, everything all together into these boiling pits. That would cause the nut oils to float to the top of the pit, and you can scoop it off. This is an example of what the nut oils look like. It looked like milk. The Europeans that came here were always trying to figure out what animal these people were milking. They couldn't figure it out, but this is just high in fats and proteins from the nut oils. And these were used for a high energy drink, sort of the beginning of Gatorade. The nut meat would float in the middle of that watery solution. You take a strainer and scoop that out and put it on the side, and you can mix it with your foods or eat it raw, or you can make a bread out of it, a flour out of it. The nut shells would float to the bottom of the pit, and they would collect those and use those. And you actually find more burned nut shells in their fireplaces than you do wood at this time. Also about this time, you could build a campfire and cook foods, but they found a more efficient way of processing foods, and they developed earth ovens. And this is an example of an earth oven, where you dig a pit about 2-3 feet in the ground. You take limestone in this area, heat it up till it's red hot, put them in the pit, put turkey or deer or fish on top of that, cover it over with hot rocks, and then seal the whole thing over. And in the same amount of time it takes you to cook a turkey in a modern day oven, it comes out done, and much juicier than it does in a conventional oven, and with a nice smoky flavor. They would wrap the meat with wild grape leaves and other kinds of leaves like that to keep the dirt and the ash of it, but you also gave it a fruity taste. Also at this time, you find these iron being collected and actually exchanged from place to place. And they look like they're necklaces, or some people think that they're used for catching animals with, but instead these were used for tying onto nets in order to catch fish. This is the more common way of catching fish with these long nets, where you get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people and you walk out into the river or ponds, and then you move back in. And by the time you get inshore, you have thousands of fish in those nets. You put them over a smoky fire, and then it preserves the meat. And you've got enough food in one morning's activities to live off of for months. So you see, fish was number 1 for food. Waterfowl was number 2, and then deer was 3rd. Deer was probably something like steak. They had it maybe once in a while. About 3,000 years ago, you start to see permanent villages and people starting to exchange goods over long distances. We used to think that was because the populations got too large and people had to live together in villages. Now we think it's just the opposite. The economy was actually expanding, not declining at this time, with all these special processing tools. And so what they would do, they would set up a village near where good sources of chert, which is what you all have out there in Wildwood, good sources of chert, Burlington chert, which is used to make extremely sharp tools. And it was traded all over North America. You find it down at the mouth of the Mississippi River at this time. Lead was traded, all these other things. And so people would set up permanent homes near those locations so they could take advantage of that trade and those goods. This is one of the houses. The house, all those circles you see around the edge aren't for posts, but they were for storage pits. The posts were actually on top of the ground. This one was actually an earth home. So they dug out a little shallow area, and then the dirt on the top they would use to put the poles for their homes. And then all those pits you see there are storage pits. Now they didn't have all those open at one time. They probably had one or two. And as they got old or started to collapse, they filled them in and dug another pit. So this is, you can see, this is a good example of how this building was used for a long period of time. About 2,000 years ago, they're starting to stay in place so long that they start to establish cemeteries and burial mounds. And mounds were used as places to mark that it was an important village, or to mark that these people claimed the local resources. And it was also used to bury the elite members of the villages. You see some people becoming being more successful and having more power than everybody else, and having more exotic goods with them. It's at this time trading's going on all over North America. And so you get marine shell beads, copper from the Great Lakes coming down here, bear claws, fossilized shark's teeth from Florida, highly ornate pottery being produced at this time. So it's no different than people today going out and buying Italian shoes or English suits or eating Russian caviar. This was the same thing going on at this time. It was just different objects, but they're used in the same way we use them today. And you see these large market centers developing at this time. And these people at the head of the markets gaining a lot of power and prestige. And they wanted to flaunt that because that encouraged more people to come work for you, just like cities today encourage people to come work for them and to make their economies even better over time. Oops. The pottery was interesting. You find this Spoonbill Duck effigy that was common from Ohio to Missouri to Minnesota. It's widely spread. And it probably, like the Greeks, where they put heroes and stories on their pottery, these people did the same thing. I wish we could find the story of the Spoonbill Duck. It was a real popular one, evidently. Another thing that's common about 2,000 years ago are what we call Casper the ghost images. And these are look like sleeping people. And we're not certain if these are just dolls or if they're like Kachina dolls from the Southwest, which were showing spirits or gods. Or if they were, it's more commonly believed that they had a form of ancestor worship, similar to what the Japanese have. And they were honoring their dead ancestors with these, remembering their dead ancestors with these kinds of things. Then around 1,500 years ago, it all stops. The long distance trading stops, the big villages stop, and people start using just these cord marked pottery, no longer decorated potteries. There's no attempt to decorate them at all. Some people have compared this to the Dark Ages, which occur about the same time, about 300 AD. So it occurs about the same time here in the Americas. So they don't know if there's some kind of global thing going on or what. I think it's a social change going on, where instead of people flaunting their goods, it was sort of like a hippies movement or a socialist movement that occurred, where people are now honored or thought of being more important if they gave away more goods or if they didn't show these showy displays of affluence that they did before. This, you notice this pot is different from the earlier ones, which had rounded bottoms or flat bottoms. This one has a conical shape. You think, well, why would they do that? That'd be hard to stand up. Well, it would be hard to stand up, but because of its shape, you can get a more even distribution of heat on these vessels. So it's almost cooking like a Chinese wok. Food doesn't burn on the bottom as readily as it does in a flat bottom pot or a rounded pot. And so you can get, you can cook your foods more thoroughly and more quickly. It was at these times that people became full-fledged farmers. They did play with agricultural goods from as early as 4,000 years ago when they started growing gourds. Gourd's not important for food. It's used more for a container. So you do see the first agricultural products weren't actually for food. And then over time, they started bringing in some foods. Now, about 2,000 years ago, during that trading time, corn was introduced from Mexico into this area. Oops. But nobody wanted it. Instead, what they raised were plants that are common weeds in our area today: goosefoot, knotweed, maygrass, and little barley. These plants have a starchy seed on them, just like corn. And you could make them. What they did, they altered the seeds on these plants so that they were larger and had a thinner seed coat. Quinoa is one of those crops. I've been saying for years we should be growing these foods because they don't take fertilizer like our corn does, and you don't have to pamper it like corn. It grows around your houses all the time. And so it would be one of the easiest plants to grow. Even in an urban lot, a vacant lot, you could grow these plants. And we've now found out that quinoa is actually very healthy for you. It has all the amino acids that your body needs. Now, we still haven't figured out a way to tie it into our diet yet. And that's the one holdback. And the prices of it haven't dropped yet. But, if you start making more and more of it, it could be used. I mean, you could use it for ethanol as well, since it's starch. About 1,000 years ago, you start to see these small farmsteads become, again, big cities. And I mean big cities. Cahokia had 30,000 people, larger than London, England at that same time. And St. Louis had a large mound group as well, with 26 mounds at its location. And a big village surrounding it, which I'd love to find that. I know it still exists somewhere there, but nobody's been able to find any evidence of it as yet, but I'm sure it's buried beneath the city. This would be just north of the Arch is at today. We did look at the Dampier site, which is in Chesterfield Valley, and was one of those market centers. When they put the levee in, they dug out this big borrow pit. Well, they forgot to do the archaeology first. And so the Army Corps made them do archaeology around the outer edges of the borrow pit. So we were only looking at a place of about 20 feet wide, maybe 30 feet wide. And out of it just came amazing things. We got these buildings here, which are square. Most houses at this time were rectangular shaped. And most of the storage pits and things like that are outside the homes, not inside of them. These had all the storage pits inside the houses. Even had shelving inside these houses where you can find the evidence of the shelving. And one of these produced 37 marine shell beads from the Gulf of Mexico. What this is a market center. And so while they displayed their goods outside, their extra goods they kept inside the building, and they also used it as a place to sleep at night and to cook foods at night. And so that was the market center that we had there. Bean found this kind of curious object. It's a ear vertebra that had an engraved image in it, and it's an engraved image of a snake. And if you notice the green color is because this was covered with copper. So they may have put that on as a template and then incised that image into the copper. I also found a temple. This L-shaped building was a temple where we found, you can see the doorway, and then just inside was a large post. Now it's strange, the post wasn't in the center of the building, so it didn't hold up the roof. And also next to it was an offering pit, which had a number of fish bones in it. So we thought that's pretty strange. And so when you're getting ready to enter this building, and you come into from the light of the outside to the darkness of the inside, what you'd be staring you back in the face is this statue of an image of one of their gods staring you back in the face. So you can see it was meant for its awe, just like our churches are meant the same way. This site also produced 5 objects that are known as long-nosed god mask. Only 20 of these have been found in the country, and this one we had 3 different masks that came from the same location. And this is what one looked like that came from the St. Louis Mound Group. It has these long nose. It's an image of a person with a feathered headdress and a long bird-like nose. And it's probably based on a myth of Longhorn, who wore these kind of things in his ear. And he would trick, when he's playing games, he would trick, at the time, they thought Titans, just like the Greeks had argued that gods had beaten Titans. This is the same sort of thing where they were taking on Titans in competition. And long-nosed god mask in his ear would wink at him and distract them so they would lose. Well, it turned out the Titans finally won. They took Longhorn and divided his body into parts and put it in different parts of the world. And his sons came together, fought the Titans, beat them, and reassembled their fathers. So it's very similar to the Osiris story of the Egyptians. And it's, again, we're meant to reflect that you have life and death and the closeness of families. Then we have this U-shaped building that was there. Here's one in on the Missouri River Bluffs, again, very close to where you all are at. That had a U-shaped shape to it. And these were charnel houses where the dead were laid out. And then their bones, when their bones were left, they were gathered up and put in those boxes in the back. And they would be brought out for special activities. You just notice they had a fire in this image. We found a large fire right in the front of this place. One of the things that's interesting when you're standing at the temple for the spring or fall equinox, the sun would appear to have risen right out of the front end of that building. So tying the image, the chiefs with the spirits of the gods and the sun. After this time period, for around some reason, about 1400, it's all gone. No, we have not found one prehistoric site dating to that time yet. And it's a real mystery as to where they all went. What happened to these people? They had the largest population in the country in this area. It had very rich and elaborate societies, and yet they all left it. The French, when they got here, recorded this area as an open territory where tribes from all over would come and hunt and trap and gather plants, and then they would go back to their villages and other places. Nobody tried to stay here. When people tried to stay here, then these other groups would beat them up and they'd get out. So it's a real mystery why this area was abandoned during that time, until the coming of the French. And the French and the Americans started in this area. And most people assume, why do archaeology on historic sites? Don't history books tell us all about them? And one of the things we found out, history books just don't tell us near the picture of what people's lives were like in the past. And it's oftentimes wrong. And so working like crime scene investigators, you can see and be able to rewrite history and bring back the truth of some of these things. And this is our popular images of how homes at the time, with the spinning wheel and the gun over there. And Daniel Boone, of course, they always depict Daniel Boone as wearing his coonskin hat. He hated coonskin hats. He thought that they were fur hats. He thought were just made his head itch and they were too hot. He hated them. We looked at the Daniel Boone home. Out there, they were saying that stone house was built in a year and everybody was living in it really quickly. Well, what we've seen in other places is that people build a log cabin and they stay in that log cabin for about 5 or 10 years until they get enough capital and money from having moved to this new area to build something fancier. And that's what I think happened here. And we did a survey outside the area and found a lot of early 1800s artifacts were in this location. And when we dug it, lo and behold, we did find this is a cellar underneath a kitchen of a building that was there. The fireplace is just up to the upper right there. And that was then intact. And so the building probably looked like this. It's probably a tomb pin building with a central fireplace. On the other side of it, we found a large storage pit. And you see that the darker soil, again, these storage pits change. Whenever you dig a hole in the ground, you change the color and the feel of the dirt. So that darker circle is where the pit had been dug in the past. And then you just remove that darker fill, and this is what it looked like. What's interesting about this pit is that it's bell-shaped. It's very narrow on top and widens at the bottom. That is not a European storage pit. That is a Native American storage pit. And we know that Daniel Boone was captured by the Native Americans. And so either him or his sons learned how to build storage pits similar to them. And were using it in their house to keep their furs and that in. Now, what type of plates did people have? Not pewter plates, not wooden plates. But English creamwares, even though the Americans were at odds with the English for most of this time, they loved their English dinner settings. So English creamwares, and a little bit later on, pearlwares were real popular. Creamwares are called creamware because they had a cream color, and then pearlware had a pearl color too. And then redwares, which were used before the during the 1600s, were relegated to the kitchen and used for storage crocks and jugs. Sometimes you can find the food. And again, they didn't eat deer, they didn't eat bear, but their main source of meat was hogs and hominy, corn mixed with lime. Native Americans may have actually developed that technique, and that actually adds calcium to the corn, which is oftentimes a limiting nutrient in people's diet. But when Daniel Boone came here, he was leading a herd of about just over 50 hogs. From his sons and him drove from Kentucky to their new home in Missouri. You can sometimes find the gun parts. They do have British flints and French flints that were there, but you also see the local church, the Burlington church like you all have in your area, was oftentimes used to make gun flints. And again, it was something that the Europeans learned from the Native Americans. We often think that it's one-way thing, that Native Americans got all the knowledge and everything from the Europeans and nothing went back, but it did. There was a lot of knowledge that went back and forth. After 1830, you get a whiteware vessel that becomes real popular. And, momentary pause. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Just in case you forgot anything that happens. So, I've been accused of actually doing these this fast. So whitewares, this is probably the most common pattern for whitewares, this blue shell edge pattern, which was painted blue on the outside edge of it. That was, we found that at Daniel Boone home. You find that in the cities. Everybody was using that type of plate. And then the other common one is the sprig pattern, which is floral design. That was real common, painted on the vessels. But more popular were transfer prints, where you take, just like a printing press, you would decorate the pots, vessels with these things. The advantage of that is that you could have matching sets. And if you broke your tea saucer, well, then you could go buy another one that matched it. And they were really highly ornate, the pattern covering almost the whole vessel. And there was a lot of classical scenes, Chinese scenes. During the War of 1812, the British people were trying to get, the manufacturers were trying to get the Americans to buy their goods. So they would put American soldiers kicking English soldiers' butts as they were walking by. So anything to keep the economy going in England at that time. The Germans introduced stonewares into this area. Stonewares were originally invented as an alternative to dinner setting, but they were too heavy and thick, and so became relegated to the kitchen. And these replaced redwares during about the 1830s, 1840s. After that time, the only place you'll find redwares are on flower pots. Cemeteries. Everybody thinks that cemetery bodies have been moved. Every cemetery you go to, they moved the bodies. This is the second Catholic burial ground in St. Louis City, where the Choteaus were buried and many of the other famous citizens of St. Louis. It was the main cemetery for the Catholics in St. Louis. Next to it is the Methodist Cemetery and the Presbyterian Cemetery. So there's thousands of people here. When we found this, not one body had been moved. All the headstones are gone, but none of the bodies had been moved. And some of the people there were very affluent, very rich, we could see. You can see that when you got here, you can see the actual grave shafts, that little sort of hexagonal thing, that's a grave shaft that was dug for the grave. And then you put in the actual coffins were intact. Here we had excellent preservation and the coffins were in great shape. They collapsed, but they were in great shape. The bodies also were in great shape. They're still doing things, writing in medical journals on the forensic information that they're learning from these bodies. One thing people don't realize, though, is there's a lot of valuable cultural information that could come from these. At the time, this cemetery was set up in a grid pattern. You can see it's not a very nice grid pattern. Bodies are everywhere. I'm sure if you looked at the headstones at the top, they were in all nice, neat rows. But underneath the ground, they're kind of a little bit helter-skelter. They're somewhat of a grid, but not really. The grid pattern was based on St. Louis that was formed by the French and then the early Americans. And the Americans loved the idea of a grid because when you're starting this new country, this new United States, how do you have individual freedom but draw everybody together as one common goal? A grid was a perfect way. You could have the grid allowed everybody equal access to the rivers, equal access to the cooling breezes or the sunlight. You've got the church at one corner and the bars at the other corners. So this was a very equitable way of setting up the city. The cemetery just reflected that pattern. At this time, before this time, death was considered frightening. They thought if you had bread, it would mold if it was near a cemetery. But after 1800, they started to preach a new thing where the person who died was just a momentary parting, and then again, you'll see them again. And that's what was reflected in what we found here, is that they were being buried in a burial gown, more like a nightgown than a burial shroud. And they were held together in the back by one to three buttons. Now, at this time, they did not bury goods with the people. The only goods you found with these were Catholic medallions or some rosary beads. What's interesting about the rosary beads is that you have this set of 5 that comes down to the crucifix. Every rosary bead we found were broken at that midsection point. None of the crucifixes were found. So we don't know if that was just part of the burial ceremony where they gave it to the next living relative as an assurance that they would again meet together again, or if it was the sextons who was burying that, who was stealing the crucifixes and then selling them for rum on the side. After the 1850s, you start to get, even in the middle of cities, you can find remains of things intact. This one was interesting in that Cochrane Gardens had been, low-income housing had been constructed in that area with buildings 12 stories high with basements in them. You would say, no chance of anything being intact here. Well, lo and behold, yes, we did. We found all kinds of cisterns, privies, all kinds of remains that were behind these buildings. This one pit, this rectangular one to the left, that was the only one that had been damaged. You can see that little brown area in the middle. That's where a sewer line to one of the housing complexes had been constructed right through the middle of that. But the Privy Pit itself was intact, and it turned out to be an old one. It's a mid-1800s one that it was wood lined. Privies are great for archaeologists because that's where they dump garbage. And you can actually see, they're like little time chests. So you can see, sometimes you can actually associate garbage from an individual family at these locations. So they're really interesting looking at these privy pits. Then you have stone-lined, brick-lined, you have cisterns. Cisterns were used for running water off guttering off the home into these pits where they would store water, and they would use that for cleaning and washing clothes. Sometimes they would even drink out of it. And then you have wells. Everybody didn't have a well. You had one block that would work for a 3 to 5 block area. And everybody'd have to walk to the well and carry the water back to their homes. St. Louis very early did have water, but most people did not go for it at that time. In the 1850s, you see a change in the plates where they go from pure white plates instead of those highly ornate plates. Even though they produced them, nobody wanted them. They wanted pure white plates. And part of that was due to Victorian influence, where they thought that your environment, what you ate, where you lived. For instance, the guy on the right lived in a good, clean life. He ate good, clean food. He exercised. The guy on the guy on the left. The guy on the right hung out in smoky bars and pool halls, and he did drinking, and it reflected in not only it reflected in his appearance as well. They thought you could spot criminals by appearance, and that's what this is a book teaching people how to spot criminals by appearance alone. it was just part of the Victorian ideas that and so that's why having a pure white plate was so essential, so that you could have pure, wholesome food, that your food wasn't tainted or spoiled when you ate it. Smoking pipes. By 1860s, they no longer used clay pipes, but they used these small pipes made of meerschaum and briar and porcelain and redwares and that kind of thing. However, what we found is that even though you cannot find one of these pipes in any store catalog at the time, these pipes continued to be used, these clay pipes, all the way up until about the 1900s and into the 1900s. And that's something you just don't hear in history books as actually happening. And then even the 1890s, you'd think, why? You know, we even got moving pictures by the early 1900s, so why even bother with the 1890s and the early 1900s? But again, the stories we hear are about the wars, they're about the wealthy families. What do we know about the common everyday folks' lives that lived in Wildwood or lived in St. Louis? And so looking at these places will tell us. These were a place where the Missouri Botanical Garden was going to, it was a parking lot, and they were going to build their new multimodal facility there. And they had homes like these on it at one time, but those were all torn down. And in the back of the homes, you have these water closets. One of the privies were open on the bottom because they didn't want to, they wanted all the liquids to flow out. And so what you'd have is these narrow spaces between homes. You'd have a privy right next to a water closet, or sorry, right next to a cistern, or right next to your well. It's amazing to me anybody survived the 1800s. St. Louis actually had ordinances. They thought that the vapors, the smells were how you contracted diseases. And so St. Louis had rules that you could only clean out these privies at night and not in the height of summer when the smells would be disseminated or go further. So you could only do it during the winter months. And it was the way you got rid of the trash. But what they do at the privy fill, they would take them and then use them for fertilizer in the agricultural fields. So again, it doesn't surprise me there's all these diseases at the time. I'm just amazed anybody survived it at all. By the 1870s, they understood germ theory, and in the 1880s, St. Louis started developing rules against these privies and started demanding water closets. And the difference between a water closet and a privy is that it was brick lined all the way, even the bottom was brick lined. And what you do is you run the guttering off your house, and there would be one pipe on the right there that would come into this water closet, and then a lower pipe on the left that would take it from there to the sewers, which had massive sewers underneath all the city streets in St. Louis. And so that would get rid of your liquid waste. Now, solid waste couldn't go through there because they were afraid of it clogging up. And people still use these as places to dump trash. They didn't have regular trash pickup. So this was the best way to get rid of trash. So they did have a grate, or in this case, they had a brick blocking the lower pipe. In the 1920s, you can see people started putting in indoor toilets. And then what they did, they just put a pipe in between the lower pipe and the sewer pipe that went to, so that they could have their indoor toilets then. The 1920s, they get very elaborate. And one of the things that's interesting, in the cities, you see these very ornate vessels with gold on them. People wanted that. But in the country, people wanted just plain white plates still. And I think what's going on in the countries, people were living near their friends and relatives. So to have a fancy gold-covered plate would make you look too uppity. But in the cities, people were transplanted from their country backgrounds with their relatives and friends and were trying to establish new friendships. And so by having these fancy plates, they could gain new friends and new relatives and even impress their boss. You start to see commercially produced condiments at that time. Milk was originally done in a big barrel, and then you'd go outside and they would dip the milk into your milk bucket. Sometimes you got a little fly or leaves in there that fell into the barrel, and that's when they came up in the 1900s with these sanitized milk bottles. Soda was always real popular from the 1850s on. Beer bottles. By the 1880s, they learned that lights, sunlight, would actually cause the hops to get a skunky flavor to them. And so the Americans started making brown bottles to protect their bill. In Europe, they started using green bottles to protect. This was a site we dug, which had all these bottles, just thousands of bottles in it. We found at least 3,063 individual beer bottles in there. A lot of them had their crown caps, and they were not just one type of beer, but there were many different types. So it wasn't a wagon turned over. What happened? I think the revenuers got it. I think this was during Prohibition, and they were running an illegal speakeasy. One of the most popular drinks at the time was Vin Mariani. Actors, politicians, even the Pope advertised for it, and have the Pope's image on an advertisement was really unusual at the time. And the Vin Mariani was special because it was Bordeaux wine with 6 milligrams of cocaine. So it was, it really invigorated you. Coke was meant as a alternative to Vin Mariani, a non-alcoholic version of Vin Mariani. This is one that was sold in St. Louis, celery soda. Sounds innocent enough, sounds healthy enough, and it's got high levels of cocaine and caffeine in it. Then you get medicines, patent medicines that were coming up, commercially produced medicines at the time. And this one, again, celery compound. Again, it cures a lot of things. Even Granny likes it. Turns out it's got celery root, hops, malt. Oh, not too bad. But then it's got cocaine and alcohol, 21% in it. Capudine. Before Bear aspirin was given up as part of the World War I reparations by the Germans, this was one of the more popular headache medicines. And it contained a 5% alcohol, caffeine, and antipyrine, which is a heart depressant. You could die if you had too much of this in you. And then the one-night cure cough syrup, it had chloroform, cannabis, and morphine in it. So no wonder people were feeling good. They weren't getting cured by anything. But it's interesting looking at these things with all the things people are throwing out for us to be taking. You know, it's a learning thing that we can learn from that. How, you know, you got to be careful on what this. In 1906, the federal government stepped in and started doing rules. And from there until the 1970s, they had rules still going in to protect us from some of these fraudulent medicines. That rich people tended to buy the medicines that would cure individual disease. Poorer people tended to get things like Liquizone, which was sold on Lawrence Welk places until fairly late in time. And it was supposed to cure all kinds of things. Again, it had absolutely nothing of value in it. It was mostly water, which is why I guess Liquizone was a good name for it. So it's these places that we study. It's not because we want the objects. The objects really don't tell us anything. It's what those objects reflect about human behavior and human ideas that are so important and so popular. And it can tell us, you know, what we are like today and how we're all products of our past. And so you can see that this is just, these objects we have are all a reflection of what we think and what we do. And so we can learn from some of these lessons. And that's really the real reason why we do archaeology. I thank you all.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks for that brief summary in the middle there. That helped refresh our memories as we move through there. So you being so diligent about getting to us and doing this presentation. So
okay, well, thank you all. Okay,
Mr. Chair, are there any questions for Mr. Harl?
Oops. This is Steve. I've got one comment that helps clarify some things, because my grandmother, around the turn of the century before then, grew up on Missouri Avenue. And I was asking her about outhouses. Do you have an outhouse? And she said, well, yeah, but I said, well, what, in the city? How did that work? He said, well, it was hooked up to the sewer and there was water flowing through it. And now I see, you know, your description of the water closet. I see now what she was talking about.
Yeah. After 1880, they came up with that. What amazed me, it went right into the local creeks and streams. St. Louis did not have a sanitary plant until 1970. Until then, it went straight to the rivers, which always amazed me it took that long.
Joe,
That's where the name, that's why we love River de Pere.
That's why we like it, yep.
So 1970, right?
1970, when they first had their first sanitary plant, yep.
That's amazing. That is truly amazing.
Yeah, it really is.
Anybody else have any questions? Just unmute and the floor is yours.
Oh, this is Steve again. I've got one question. In the Wildwood area, have you found any settlements here? Sounds like the closest one would have been down in the Chesterfield Valley there.
You have a large one right at the base of the bluffs, right near Babbler. Well, actually, right across at the edge of the bluff near Babbler, there's several large mounds, prehistoric mounds. It's actually on the National Register as a mound district. It goes from Chesterfield over into your guys' areas. Yeah, you've got several large plantations, and that's that slave cemetery thing that we looked at. You've got farmsteads. We looked at a freed African Americans home. You've got all kinds of prehistoric sites too, because you got Burlington Shirt there, and people from the earliest time on love that shirt because it can make such extremely. The shirt is sharper than any metal tool that we have today. So, and very early time, they started going at it, and about 4,000 years ago, they were trading it all over North America. So there's actually quarry pits from prehistoric times in Wildwood area. So yeah, there's quite a bit. Problem is, there just hasn't been much archaeological investigations done. So we don't know a whole lot. But yeah, there's definitely things there.
You haven't found any mammoths in Wildwood
yet, but I'm sure they're there. I would bet they're there.
Well, I keep my eyes out.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Joe.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask a question. So Burlington Shirt's a good tool. How do they tool the tool, so to speak? What do they use? Burlington Shirt?
They would use Burlington Shirt during the final stages because it was the same density as the stone. Early on, they would use what we call mounds gravel, and it's that yellow gravelly stone that you see in most of the creeks and things around here, and it's harder than the chert. And they would pound on that and knock off flakes. Make it with.
Thank you.
Sure. And in the final stages, they would use deer antlers to sharpen them up.
There's plenty of those out here now.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, well, thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you all. You have a good evening. Bye.
Joe, stay healthy and safe.
You too.
Just a quick question, Joe, before you go. Are there any new proposed digs in the St. Louis County area that will be anytime soon?
We just finished one at Jefferson Barracks. Nothing near you right now. Like that I'm trying to fight with the city of Chesterfield to preserve that big prehistoric mound. I keep telling them, you could draw people from around, those shops down there are no different than any store in England, France, or any place else in the world. They're all the same stores. You could draw people from around the world to that area if you highlighted that prehistoric village that you have there and protect it. They just want to put in subdivisions or commercial development. So they don't want to be bothered with the fact that they've got this prehistoric thing. And I'm sure there's a large burial ground out there someplace. So they're going to hit it. They've already hit some bodies when they put in their sewer lines in that area. So, and I've tried to get them excited about it and try and do something about it. Just no luck at all. And that's the thing, you know, it doesn't have to, it costs, archaeology costs less than 1% of an overall construction project. It's always nothing. But the benefits can be long-term. And, you know, we're still talking about that site. And it's been probably 10 years since we dug it. So 20 years actually. So it's one of those things that you can really highlight your community and draw people to it in that way, and have a sense of civic community pride as well. So no, unfortunately, nothing that's anywhere near you all, at least right now. Well, thank you all.
Okay.
You have a great evening.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Okay, we got